Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're discussing the topic of what does it mean to learn from failure? And we're using that particularly through the lens of the movie The Last Jedi. But we're going to be talking about this topic in all of Star Wars as well as just in all of media and in our own lives. And we think it's a really interesting element of that particular movie, one that Riki and I are both big fans of. And so we want to use it for that regard. I do want to say as a note here, because I know this movie is particularly controversial, this is not a time to review The Last Jedi. Riki and I are fans of it, are going to talk about what we enjoy about it. I know a lot of people aren't fans about it. That's totally fine. Please, I think it's totally fine to have any opinion on this movie. I think a lot of people say that any time that someone mentions The Last Jedi or anything about it, it's a time to bring back all the arguments everyone's heard before about why it's too woke or it's too this or too that or any of that stuff. Please take that somewhere else. So we want this to be a discussion about the specific question of learning from failure. As I said, I'm here with my guest, Riki. And Riki, I know this is one of your favorite movies as well. What does this idea of learning from failure mean to you? Not even in the movie itself, but just in general.
Well, I was going to start out and just say, I'll give you my review. It's my favorite Star Wars movie.
That's fair. That's fair.
Done. And I wanted to start here. I just want to quote Yoda. This is the scene where Ghost Yoda comes to Luke. He says, "Heeded my words, not did you." Yoda,
Mm-hmm.
all right. Pass on what you have learned. Strength, mastery, but weakness, folly. Failure also. Yes, failure most of all. The greatest teacher failure is. And then there's a cut, and later on he says, "We are what they grow beyond. That is the true burden of all masters."
Right.
And that's the basis of our discussion here. And it's such a Yoda thing. And to me,
Mm-hmm.
Yoda is the walking embodiment of an airport book that condenses this life philosophy and advice into one phrase, like a title
Uh-huh.
phrase. And it can be useful if you apply it properly, but if you examine it from a broad perspective, it doesn't work. Like a lot of these
Right.
things, you have to internalize the message and then find out what it means for yourself. So I do think there are nuggets of great wisdom in this, like in some airport books, but you have to be careful about how you apply that to your life,
Yeah. I think it's very
because
true.
failure, being the greatest teacher, failure sucks.
Yeah.
And it can lead you down a spiral of, I mean, frankly, depression. Right? If you keep
Mm-hmm.
failing at things, that's not that's not a good teacher, as Yoda
Right.
would say.
Well, and I think that's really essential to this idea. And I actually appreciate I use that phrase learning from failure, but I appreciate the way you're specifying it is that failure the greatest teacher is. Because you can have the best teacher in the world, and if you don't listen, you're not going to learn anything. And to me, I think that's one of the keys is you can learn from failure, but you have to that isn't just going to hit you over the head. You have to be willing to, first of all, acknowledge your failures and look at your failures. And you have to be willing to be critical and not just say, oh, this is someone else's fault, or if this had happened, then I wouldn't have failed, but be willing to say, what did I do wrong? How did I fail? And what can I learn from this so that I don't do this again? Because you're right, when you're just stuck in that cycle of failure, it feels terrible for you. Often you can wind up hurting others. That's not a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about, a context of a job performance, if you keep failing, you might be learning stuff, but you also might get fired because you're just not doing your job correctly, right? So there's I mean, to use another catchy phrase, in the context of a job, they say if you're good at your job, you keep getting promoted until you're bad at your job, right? So that's the point of failure. Ideally, maybe you stop just before that because you recognize you kind of reached a good balance point. But like you can't success is also a good teacher to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
So I do find it interesting because in that moment, in this movie, Luke has expressed like he failed because Rey has just left. So he like fails as a teacher, and he is recalling how he failed um with Ben Skywalker or Ben Solo, Kylo
Mhm.
Ren, right? So he is stuck in this kind of loop of depression where I failed twice, and now like I created Kylo Ren, and now Rey's going off to try to talk to him, and she's gonna turn to the dark side. So he's stuck in this loop, and Yoda is trying to bring him out of that and show Luke that he has not yet failed with Rey. Like he has taught her some lessons, but it's time to let her make her own decisions about things.
Right. Yeah, I think that the timing of what Yoda says there is so important. First of all, because of everything you said, but also because, and here's where we're starting to get into this wider question, there are patterns of failure that are repeating all throughout this. To me, I think one of the, like Luke's failure with Ben, I think is very intentionally meant to mirror Obi-Wan's failure with Anakin. And that's a much deeper subject. And obviously, Anakin was, very empowered in his own choices and all kind of stuff. But certainly, I mean, Obi-Wan himself said, I thought I could teach this person as well as Yoda did. I was wrong. And I, I also think, though, that part of what Yoda is saying here is that because part of what Luke has said in response is, in being critical of the Jedi, is he said, the Jedi utterly failed to see that Sidious was rising, to failed to prevent, Anakin from falling and all that. And I think when Yoda says this, he's not just saying, Luke, you need to learn from your failure. He's saying, Luke, you need to learn from mine. Because what he's saying is that,
Mm.
because Luke and Rey have to rebuild the Jedi, and really Rey will have to rebuild the Jedi. And I think for me, part of why that line is so powerful is because it is Yoda saying, don't just follow the Jedi texts exactly. Don't try to do things exactly how you're right, Luke. We, the Jedi of the prequel era, failed. You have to learn not just from your failure, but from ours and see how to best go forward.
Oh boy. Okay. I don't know that Yoda would admit that he failed.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if he's saying that. I think we agree, I think that the Jedi Council failed, right? In
Right.
terms of the conflict with the Sith and letting Sidious take control. And we could talk about that, but is Yoda admitting that he failed? I don't know about that.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah. Well, listeners, let us know what you think because, yeah, to me, that's very much what it's about. I think in particular because of it's coming so. I th- in particularly because of all that Lucas said about because when he critiques that the Jedi of that time, he doesn't say you did this, but he very much Yoda was one of the leaders of that as was Mace Windu, as was everyone else. And I do want to just also interject here, just because I think this is another thing that internet debate can get real, can go really far in bad directions on. I do not think that the failure of the Jedi, let me put this differently. I do not think that the fall of the Republic, the fall of the Jedi, or the fall of Anakin, for me, none of those, the conversation of blame and failure is not zero sum. I think a lot of people try to get into an argument of, oh, it wasn't Anakin's fault at all because the Jedi failed, or because it was all Palpatine, so it's no one else's fault. I'm not trying to say who has more fault or less fault. I think in the end, most of it rests with Anakin himself, at least in that particular department, and it was Sidious himself. But I think that we can still say that, without making it about one more than the other, that the Jedi failed in terms of how they didn't see Sidious coming, they didn't see the fall of the Republic and of the Jedi and Anakin coming.
I actually put a lot more blame on the Jedi Council, and
Mm-hmm.
probably specifically Yoda. Like the show The Acolyte is about to come out, and I feel my gut is that this is going to show us that Yoda is much more at fault
Mm-hmm.
than previously shown to be.
That's
Because
totally
I just
fair.
find it hard to believe that we reach a point in the Phantom Menace, right, where they say the Sith have been extinct for 1,000 years, and Yoda has been alive for most of that, and has seen some stuff, and we'll probably see some things in the Acolyte ? And I think in that scene, he gives Mace a look. And
Yeah.
it's always been a question of like, well, what does that look mean? I think the new interpretation of Star Wars is going to be that they knew and they were hiding stuff from the rest of the council.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I've always thought that it's the other way, that because of their belief and the High Republic books go into this somewhat, kind of the that the Jedi just don't believe it's possible, and so they might see signs, but they don't. It's not that they know the Sith are out there; it's that they see these signs and they don't. They're like, oh no, that can't be the Sith. But you're right; the Acolyte can answer a lot of those questions, and I guess it's not that I'm saying. It's not that I'm saying that my application of where the blame falls is different than yours. It's just that I think that for me, trying to debate is it 60%, 40% doesn't really get us anywhere. But I do think that you're absolutely right that there were multiple failures there by the Jedi.
And it's interesting that, like, in this quote, like previous to the failure stuff, Yoda talks about, right? He says strength, mastery, but weakness, folly. So what he is expressing is that a master, a teacher, should not try to appear infallible to their
Yes,
student.
very
They
much so.
have to show that they themselves are fallible, because that allows the student to potentially fail and to be okay with that. It's like, oh, my master can't do everything, so it's okay that I can't do everything yet. Like, I still have a lot to learn. And that, to me, like, contradicts how Yoda acts pretty much through everything, right? Like,
Agreed.
showing weakness, folly, like, even beyond the stuff that I am expressing about what I think will happen with the Acolyte,
Mm-hmm.
already, like, Yoda has that scene with Mace, I think maybe in Attack of the Clones, where they're like, we have to keep hiding the fact that we're losing our connection with the Force
Right.
from the Senate, right? So they're hiding their weakness. And that contradicts what he's saying here.
I mean,
Go ahead.
I guess I agree with all that, but I think that's part of why he's saying this now. Because first, just on this concept, when I was in grad school studying to be a pastor, this was one of my teachers really loved to use the phrase "the wounded healer," and that as a pastor, as any kind of leader, you need to be willing to talk about your own mistakes. You need to be able to talk about as parts that people can see, like, yes, I stumbled the same way you're going to stumble, and I want to show you how I got back up again. His point being that if you've never stumbled, then someone who does stumble is never going to think that you can relate to them. And I think I've heard you say similar things when you were one of my mentors as a magic judge. I know when I talked to you about a way that I'd screwed up, you would often say, "Yeah, no, I get it," and mention some of your own failures. And certainly that was something that many of my mentors in Magic the Gathering judging have done. So yeah, so I want to get to the other part, but I just want to kind of further emphasize that idea that I do think that a teacher not only should but has to do that kind of thing, because or else A, they're setting an impossible standard, and B, the student is now going to think that if they do screw up, if they do fail, that they shouldn't talk to the master about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, like, what is it? I lost that thought. Anyway,
That's fair. Well, so let's talk about the Yoda contradicting himself, because yeah, I agree. I do agree with you there. I think that
I don't get from Yoda the regret. I agree that there are some subtexts that he is expressing that he failed, but I
mm-hmm.
just wish that he in the scene would have just like come out and said so.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And even in like the Empire Strikes Back interactions with Yoda, like he and Obi-Wan talk about how they failed with Anakin, with Vader, but I don't know. It just doesn't seem like they are necessarily taking responsibility
Mm-hmm.
for it.
I mean, is that one more of their failures that Luke has to learn from? Whether they say
Yeah.
it or not. I mean, and that it might not be that that's what Yoda's saying, but that Luke certainly has to, because we do get that great moment where in Empire, no, it's in Return of the Jedi, where Luke confronts Force Ghost Obi-Wan about what happened to his father, and Obi-Wan does what I told you was true from a certain point of view, which I've always thought is a cop-out. But what he also does say is that, as I mentioned before, that he thought he could train Anakin the way that Yoda had trained him, which we've kind of retconned somewhat, but we'll move beyond that. But that he admits he was wrong. And to me, I think that is, I think Obi-Wan failed as a teacher early on because he wasn't willing to admit that failure. He didn't want Luke to realize that Darth Vader becoming Darth Vader was in part his fault. In part, again, I don't want to start the debate about who is it more so, but to me, that is an element of Obi-Wan at least acknowledging his failure and Luke being able to see that.
Yeah, there are certainly parallels with Obi-Wan's failure with Anakin and Luke's failure with Ben.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we're missing is maybe some context of what the heck Snoke is, right?
Yeah.
Because Luke mentions in the flashback, the Rashomon style flashbacks, that like Snoke had already gotten his tendrils into Ben. And like we know so little about Snoke, like what he is, like what his powers are. They were like, oh, okay, but we ended up not understanding what that means, like compared to how Palpatine got his tendrils into Anakin, right? The
Right.
opera scene being so integral, like missing that, it's hard to contextualize like how close these two analogies are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's fair. And I don't think that it's a direct one for one analogy by any means, but I think there's some connection there. Let's talk about the role of this idea in the movie itself, because for me, this is kind of a mission statement of the movie, because it's not Luke's failure with Ben that's the only failure. Where else do you think this idea comes out in the movie?
I mean, for me, like number one is Poe Dameron.
Right.
I Poe's story in The Last Jedi is probably my favorite one.
Mm-hmm.
And I've made the comparison that, the hero's journey of Luke Skywalker, the archetype in New Hope. I think Poe goes through what I've called the leader's journey, where he starts off as this hotshot pilot who doesn't understand how to be a leader. And
Right.
he in the opening scene of this movie, he fails. Like he destroys the dreadnought, but then loses all the bombers, and General Organa chastises him for it.
Right.
He's like, but we destroyed the dreadnought. So again, like he's not understanding even that he failed in that moment.
Yeah, it's a failure to see the larger context and to trust that other people see the larger context.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's a very interesting thing, because I think to some extent he repeats the same mistake, because in that first thing, he sees a problem, the dreadnought, and he believes that there's a way for him to fix this problem. And his superiors are specifically telling him not to do this, but he goes ahead anyway. Then in the second half of the movie, when Admiral Holdo is telling him that there is a plan that he just has to trust and believe, once again, he fails because he doesn't see the context. He doesn't see, and he doesn't trust that someone else sees the context that he doesn't. So he takes Finn on this whole Canto Bight mission, which winds up in the end not only failing, but causing great harm, because it leads the not the Empire, the First Order to learn about Holdo's plan and have a lot of those things get destroyed.
Yeah.
And so is that an example, do you think, of where he doesn't learn from where failure wasn't a teacher for him, or where he just failed to learn from the teacher?
The Holdo example, I mean, by the end of the movie, he does learn, right?
Right. Agreed.
He understands like what Luke is doing, and that they should try to escape,
right,
versus try to fight the walkers outside of the base. So I don't know about the Holdo thing. Like the Holdo thing, like people are always like, oh, like Holdo should have told him. And I'm like, no, like Poe should have followed the chain of command and just
Right.
followed his orders.
Well, which is also what he didn't do with the Dreadnought.
Yeah. I can't remember if he got specific orders to
I
not
thought
attack.
Leia specifically tells him not to do this,
Maybe. It's
but I may be
possible.
misremembering. Yeah, but no, certainly I think he has a great journey, and you and I talked about a later book, the name of which is now escaping me, but is about Poe after this moment, where I think he really does acknowledge that he did learn, and I think it's that difference of that. And I hate this because like hopefully you shouldn't need this, but I feel like he got to see the cost of his failure when Holdo finally explained to him, all that had happened, and well, but then he saw the cost of his failure earlier, so it's frustrating, I think, but I think is in some way very real that he had to fail twice to learn this, and that doesn't make it good, and things would have been a lot better if he didn't, but he does learn when he's willing to listen to that teacher.
Yeah. Oh, I can't remember the name of the book either. Resistance Reborn.
Resistance. I think it's Resistance Rising, but I'll look it up while you talk.
I think it was Resistance Reborn. RR. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in this movie, like Poe definitely learns from failure. Does Finn? I don't think Finn learns from failure, unfortunately. Finn gets such a raw deal in these movies as a
He really
character.
does.
Like he
He
had
really
so
does.
much potential. They just keep sidelining him or just like having him be like too stubborn for the context of the moment.
Mm-hmm.
I wish that Finn had a bigger learning moment.
Yeah,
which he
I agree with
should,
that.
right?
I definitely feel like one of the biggest failures of that movie and of the third movie is as you say, the sidelining of that character. And while I would love for Finn to come back for the new movies they're making, I know John Boyega, the actor, is very upset about how he was treated, and I'd love to see the character back, but I also very much understand if he doesn't want to come back. What
Yeah,
about
give it some time, I would
Yeah,
say.
that's true.
Just like because I agree, like as a human being, his reaction to this whole thing is like, why would I want to go back to this?
Yep.
But we've seen like in Star Wars, like in any fandom, but in Star Wars fandom, how an initial like negative reaction to something over time, like time heals wounds, and the fandom has come around, or the fandom has, just aged and matured in a way that allows us to revisit things like
Right.
the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, and specifically Hayden Christensen coming back to Star Wars when
Right.
he was at the time like fairly maligned.
Yeah. Does Kylo Ren learn something in this movie? Or is failure a teacher for him, either before this movie or now?
He learns to walk around without a shirt on. I don't know. I just had to get that in because that scene always cracks me up.
No, it's very true. It's very true. And like, look, after the monster at the end of Attack of the Clones rips Padme's shirt in an incredibly coincidental way that just happens to expose Natalie Portman's midriff, I feel like, having some eye candy on the other direction. There's nothing wrong with that either. I think I think this is the movie where he learns to let go of Vader, which is then kind of undone by the last movie. But although it feels like he starts to learn, when he's willing to turn on Snoke. To me, is a lot about being willing to. It's funny because Poe's failure was to not listen to his superiors. I think Kylo's is that he does listen too much into both what Snoke has been saying to him and to, whatever else has been saying to him. And he's willing to turn on Snoke and recognize that Snoke is not the master he needs, but then he can't go far enough. He can't learn the lesson that Rey wants him to learn of not only are you, you're still on the dark side, you're still doing all these terrible things. And I think, and again, people have heard me rant about the problems of the last movie, and I won't go into that again. But I do think that it is one of my disappointments of the last movie that I feel like there was a real path of learning Kylo could have gone on from this moment, that instead they just took him in the direction they took him. And he does learn some things by the end because the magical power of kissing Rey, but again, that's a whole other discussion. But do you think there's some element to which he does partially learn in the way his attitude towards Snoke changes?
I think that's a symptom, or maybe like a result.
Mm-hmm.
But the real, like, so Kylo Ren's failure in the context of this trilogy is like killing Han Solo, like killing his father, is his point of failure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where he makes a turn, and I think the point that he learns and comes back from that, at least in this movie, obviously, like in the last movie, he has a bigger moment, but in this movie, like he doesn't kill Leia, his mother,
Mm-hmm.
right? When he's in the fighter and has a
Right.
bead on the bridge of her ship, it ends up being one of his wingmen that fires the
Mm-hmm.
shot. So he stops himself there, but more importantly, like reaching out to Rey, using the connection, the dyad connection with
Mm-hmm.
Rey, and literally touching
Right.
hands, right? In that moment is him exposing himself, like, and if we're talking about it in the context of the Yoda quotes, like showing weakness or vulnerability is a better
Right.
term in that moment, right? Taking off the glove again, like you mentioned letting go of Vader. He Is it this movie where he like literally beats up his own mask?
I believe it is. Yeah, he certainly takes off the mask for a lot of the movie.
Yeah. And then in the scene with Rey, he takes off his glove as well in order to touch hands with her.
Right.
So reconnecting, like literally connecting, like right on the nose,
Yeah.
but showing vulnerability and a willingness to reach out to someone and share this bond is
Yeah.
important.
No, I think that's true. And I think, in a way, as I think about it more, I realize I think both the scene where Ray and Ben both try to convince each other to join their side, I think you can see as a failure for both of them, because Kylo wants to convince Ray to join the dark side, and she wants to convince Ray to step away from it, or she wants to convince him to step away from it. And I think it's a really interesting question of how do they both learn from that, and because I think it's very intentional, right? Like I think a lot of the complaints people get about this movie is that, oh, everybody fails, so what's the point? And I think that to me, it feels like every failure in this movie is very intentional because of how it reflects to this mission statement, and that I'm not really sure how much Kylo and Rey learned from their failure in that moment. But I think certainly what Ryan was trying to set up was that in the third movie it would address that. And we, putting aside my own feelings about it, we can at a later date talk about, like, do we think that each of them learns in the third movie? But I certainly think
No.
that that
My
scene was
answer
supposed
is
to be about,
no.
well, but I certainly think that the scene was supposed to be about both of them failing.
Yeah. Yeah. They do kind of come together in Rise of Skywalker, obviously, but
Right.
not in the way that this movie seems to be suggesting, or at
Yeah.
least
Well,
I
again,
was projecting.
I was trying to put that part of the discussion off for another point. I just want to talk about
Mhm.
it in this one.
And yeah, like the problem with Kylo Ren, even like through even throughout the Rise of Skywalker, is that he no, I mean he does end up being more vulnerable. I think that's the point, right? Is like
Mm-hmm.
he shows his vulnerability to Ray at least,
Right.
and that is the lesson
Mm-hmm.
that we're trying to learn from this moment or from this quote.
Right. Well, certainly he fails catastrophically when it comes to the final scene on the Salt Moon. And so here's a question I have for you that actually I'm not sure about either. Yoda has reminded Luke that failure is the greatest teacher. Luke feels, I think rightly so, that he failed Ben Solo as his master.
Mm-hmm.
Luke is obviously trying to help make sure the Resistance escapes. I think that is very important. But do you think he's also trying to help to give Kylo Ren a failure that he can learn from in the way he confronts him at the end of the movie?
I'd never got that impression. For me, that scene is mostly about helping the Resistance escape and imparting the future to Rey.
Right.
Because the final part of the quote is "We are what they grow beyond," and he
Right.
says like, "I will not be the last Jedi." Like he is passing on the mantle
Mm-hmm.
and saying like, "My moment has passed. Like it's not my time anymore.
Yeah.
It's Rey's time."
I think all of that is true. And maybe again that I'm like, because I love this mission statement so much, I want to read it into everything. So again, fans, tell me if you strongly disagree. I think that those are all his primary goals. But I do think that, to me, part of Kylo Ren's failure, part of his problem, like a lot of the dark side, is, what Luke said to Palpatine back in Return of the Jedi, that his overconfidence is his failure, and that his belief in his own power is his failure. And I think that's a big part of what happens in this movie, is that Luke is, because he's not the he defeats him. It's that he shows that he can trick him, that all these powers that he has, all this machinery, you can fire all these weapons, and it won't matter because we can still find a way to get around you. So yeah, to me, there's an interesting lesson there, and I think we can talk about what happens. But I totally get that. I may just be projecting like crazy here. That's fair too.
Project away.
Yeah. The last and big question I wanted to bring up is, do you think this is a new idea in Star Wars? How have we seen people learning from failure at other points in the Star Wars movies?
Well, you got to go back to Empire Strikes Back
Mm-hmm.
because that's the original Yoda Luke interaction. And he
Right.
actually, like, there's actually a section of the training where failure is important. Well, there's a couple, like, he failed a lot in his training.
Yep.
He fails in the dark side cave because he doesn't listen to Yoda and takes
Right.
a weapon with him and uses it. And
And
then he fails to lift the X-wing, where
just one thing.
specifically.
Just
Oh,
one
go
thing on
ahead.
that. Just one thing on that first one. I think also kind of similar to Poe, he believes that he has defeated his enemy. Like he has a fight with Darth Vader and he wins. And it's only when he sees his own face and comes to realize the point of it. So yeah, I think that's a very important. Just want to add that as more context for that. Sorry, go on to the second one though, and we can keep discussing them all.
Well, yeah, when he's lifting the X-wing specifically, like Yoda uses the word failure there,
Mm-hmm.
right? He doesn't lift the X-wing. Yoda does. Luke says, "I don't believe it," and Yoda says, "That is why you fail."
Right.
And there's also before that, obviously, like he doesn't use the word failure, but the most famous Yoda quote, right? "Do or do not. There is no try," is interesting to me in the context of this discussion because do or do not can be translated into this context as succeed or fail. But there is no try, it would be like don't half-ass it.
Oh, see, it's interesting because I took that in a very different way. Because to me, and maybe this is again where I also see what Yoda says differently. I always took do or do not as, and this is why I don't love the phrase, as kind of basically saying, like, if you really want to do this, you will do this and you won't fail. And the idea that you will try, but you might fail, Yoda is saying, I don't think that's possible. And to me, that's also one. And I think there's later scenes in Rebels where Kanan kind of disagrees with that, and the Yoda he's talking to kind of agrees with him. And so for me, taking those things, both of those things in mind, and again, I wish that Yoda was more explicit, so maybe I'm reading too much into it. But to me, him saying failure is the greatest teacher, you don't fail unless you try. Like that feels to me like him acknowledging that saying do or do not, or there's no try, is a stupid thing to say. Because
Yeah, I mean
you have to
that's
try
why,
in order
like I
to fail.
said, these are like airport books
Yeah, exactly.
where it's a snappy phrase, but you
Right,
have to apply the lesson to yourself, to your own life.
right.
So what I'm suggesting with do or do not is right, like because he says do or do not, there is no try. To do, in some context, you have to try,
Right,
and then you do, or sometimes you don't.
right.
Like the do not part, right? Like I think what we're saying, the different interpretations are do not, as in Luke doesn't even attempt to lift the X-wing,
Hmm.
or do not as he attempts to lift the X-wing but fails.
I guess the way that I see it is that it's the mentality that what
Yeah.
Yoda is saying is if you tell yourself, I'm going to move this X Wing without any thought that you might fail, then you'll do it because you are so confident in your power that you will have the power. But then if you tell yourself, I'm going to try to leave this X Wing and I don't know if I can and I might fail, but I'm going to give it my best shot, Yoda is saying that then you will fail. You have to completely believe you will succeed in order to succeed. And I simply don't think that's true. I think that's an unhelpful philosophy.
No,
And to
I,
me,
I agree.
and to me, I think that that's where because the flip side of that is you should try, and if you fail, learn from your like failure can be a good thing, and you have to fail in order to learn how to not fail.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about this topic while I was jogging, and in the context of exercise and training, whether it's like
Hmm.
endurance training or like say weightlifting, you have to try, right? Like if you're bench pressing, you're like, I don't know if I can bench press, I don't know, 200 pounds, let's say. I don't know if that's good or bad,
Yeah,
but just pick a weight. You don't know if you can do it. You have to try, right? And if you can do it, great. Then you up the weight. At some point, you can't,
right,
and you quote unquote fail, but you've learned a limit, and like that's what exercise is. Like training your muscles is about finding that failure point,
right.
reaching that point, and then you literally like break the tendons of your muscles, and then they regrow stronger, right? Like that's what exercise is. And and so like for me, like that's how I contextualize this part of it. Do or do not is like, just do it, Nike, just do it. And then
Right.
if you fail, okay, like figure it out, or like try again the next day, and then when you're a little bit stronger.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair.
And the force is weird. Like I don't know how the force, no one knows how the force works. They just make it up like per movie or TV show. But it feels like it is probably like a muscle, that there
Hmm.
is kind of like a learned or trained element to it, that if you use it, you continue to get stronger up to a certain degree.
Right.
Like Obi-Wan Kenobi showed that in the TV show, where he hadn't used the Force for 10 years or something, and he sucked at it
Yeah.
at the beginning of that show.
Every
So
time we've seen younglings, they're struggling to,
yeah,
first learn how to lift something, or, every lightsaber training scene, the Padawan is losing to the master. They're failing at defeating the master.
I do agree in the context of like when Empire Strikes Back first came out, that the quote do or do not has an element of, because Luke is like, I, I can't, like, I don't know if I can do it. I'll try, like, because it's
Right.
like he's lifted rocks, but it's like that's so big, like the X-wing, and the audience is in the same boat because we have not really seen the Force used in this context, right? To
Right.
lift something as large as an X-wing, so like, can you do that with the Force? It's like, I don't know, and Yoda is saying like, you just got to do it. You
Yeah.
you can eventually, but you just got to do it.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I not today, but I think there'd be an interesting conversation to have about how does Yoda's concept of do or do not, there's no try, compare with the Matrix's idea of there is no spoon. And granted, that's a whole other thing because it's virtual reality, but interesting thought that occurred to me as we're talking about this. Let's kind of start wrapping up. Actually, no, let me start there. There's one other instance where I think there's a couple of instances I think where characters fail and either do or don't learn in them. As I talked about before about Obi-Wan saying that he acknowledging he failed with Anakin. Do you think Luke failed when he went to Bespin to try and rescue his friends?
Did Luke fail? I mean, let's see. Yes, like from a plot perspective, he failed because he didn't save. Well, they were already rescuing themselves.
Right.
He didn't save them, and certainly didn't save Han.
Right.
Or at that point in the movie, Han.
Mm-hmm. Although there was a question of if he doesn't go, would Vader have been more like if everyone was still waiting for Luke and they had no indication Luke was going, would Vader have been able to stop them getting away?
Oh, so like he was a distraction. Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah. I've always thought this is an interesting question because his hand is chopped. He loses the fight to Vader, absolutely, but he
definitely fails in that regard. Yeah.
But remember, Vader isn't trying to kill him. Vader is trying to turn him to the dark side.
Mm-hmm.
Luke succeeds in not turning to the dark side, and Luke succeeds in getting away. And granted, he needs a lot of help for that, but Vader isn't able to either capture him or turn him to the dark side. So I've always thought it's very interesting because I always, again, in this question of like how much are Yoda and Obi-Wan right or wrong, I think that in the end, they're like, because if he doesn't go, I think it's much more likely that they all wind up captured and maybe even killed. And so I guess I've always seen it as Luke, Obi-Wan, and Yoda are somewhat wrong to tell him not to go.
Oh, they're very wrong.
Yeah.
Because they are still hiding the relationship, the fact that Vader is Luke's father.
Right.
And they're training Luke to be a weapon, right? And saying you have to kill Vader. And ultimately, that's not what happens. Luke defeats Vader in the duel in Return of the Jedi, but it's his compassion and his connection that ultimately turns Vader back to Anakin, and he helps him to temporarily defeat Sidious, Palpatine.
Yeah.
So, I absolutely think like Obi-Wan and Yoda were wrong, to like hide that from Luke and to basically like try to trick him into killing his own father without even knowing it. I think like the original trilogy is showing that they were wrong and that Luke's connection with his father is ultimately what wins everything.
Right. And I guess that's why for me, Yoda's statement feels very self-confessional because I've always seen it that part of why Yoda and Ben are so hesitant is that because Luke is trying to do the exact thing that both of them tried to do and failed. Ben tried to bring Vader back based on the love they had for each other as brothers. He couldn't do it. Yoda tried to defeat a Sith Master in Palpatine and couldn't do it, as well as all of and that because to me, I think to some extent that scene on Dagobah is both of them not being willing to acknowledge that Luke is going to grow beyond them. And so for me, when Yoda says they are behind, he's saying Rey's going to grow beyond you the same way you grew beyond me.
Yeah, okay. I think I can get behind that. I just wish we don't need everything to be as explicit as you mentioned the Matrix before, and the scene where Trinity is like, "No, Neo, you can't die," because the Oracle said that I would fall in love with a one.
Mm-hmm.
I love you. It's like at
Yeah.
least one stage too far. I needed like another stage of Yoda saying, "You gotta let Rey try." I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think like I'm headcanoning like crazy here, and I think you're right. Sometimes it goes too far, and I think Ryan left it a little
Yeah,
understated.
it doesn't need to be. Look at how we didn't let you talk to Vader, and then like ultimately because you talked to him, that's what turned the tide and got him to turn back to the light side. It doesn't have
Right.
to go that far, but I think it's like, yeah, like give Ray a chance, like to do it her way.
Yeah.
And it's I agree. Like looking at it now, that is what it's implying. I just need it to be stage two,
Yeah. No,
not left
I
at
hear that.
stage one.
I hear that. And yeah, I wish that had been in this movie. Wish that had been in the next movie. But we have. All right. Any other last comments you want to make on this before we move into a member section? We're going to talk a little bit more about the Last Jedi and just some of the other things we loved about it. I guess let me actually ask you this then. What do you see as the value? Because I think is again one of the things that's most debated, but I think it is part of this mission, this whole idea. What is the importance of the Canto Bite scene and that whole plot line?
I have no idea. Canto Bite. There's a whole book. I have to read that book because I can't believe like they would make a whole book about Canto Bite.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. Maybe the point of Canto Bite is it's the failure of this movie, and that
Mm-hmm.
it gives us like a whole other planet and whole scene that I understand like where it's supposed to fit, but it doesn't fit that well in this
Yeah.
movie, and it just feels like they needed to fill time.
Mm-hmm.
So I enjoy Canto Bite, but I feel like it's never really earned its keep.
That's fair. I I think that it does have a point in that I think, like I was saying before, I think it's that Poe hasn't fully learned his lesson and has to have it drilled in even further. Um, but given how disastrously the dreadnought thing goes, I do agree with you that maybe I'm not sure it's needed. Like I think I know exactly what Ryan Johnson was doing with it, and I think he does that well in that it is this other existence of failure, and particularly Poe to some extent repeating his failure. Um, and I'm
Well,
so
either
torn.
Poe or Finn. Like it's a lot more about Finn.
Well, but Poe is the one who doesn't trust Holdo, and thus comes up with this idea that him and Finn should go off on this mission together.
Yeah, I just
And
it's
I agree
just
with you that it probably would have worked a lot better if Finn had had some important lesson that he learns as part of it. But he then, according to the movie, fails again. With him trying to wreck the Star Destroyer power cannon on the ground thing that he does. Um,
well, it's so weird because Finn like they fail to connect with the master splicer, right,
right?
in the casino. And then just luck into what's his name, DJ,
Yeah.
who was like almost master splicer or like splicer enough. And I think the problem I have with that whole section is that it doesn't seem like they have agency because of that, because they just
Mm-hmm.
kind of like fall into DJ or he falls into their lap. It's like,
Right.
oh, well, he's good enough, right? Like, let's go. And so I
Yeah.
never quite got behind that part of it.
I think that's
And
fair.
maybe that's the point because that does ultimately lead to them getting caught because
Right.
DJ betrays them.
I mean, on some level, I think you could look at it as the kind of Picard lesson that's quoted on so many memes of sometimes you can do everything right and still fail, which I think is another idea. But it's
They don't do
I
everything. They don't do
yeah
everything right.
I,
They kind of keep failing and like, oh well, this is good enough. It just
I've spent so much time defending this movie that I want to defend it here. But I think on
no,
some
don't
level you're
do it.
right. Yeah, I think that um
Canto Bite is the weakest part of the movie, in my opinion, because of this like falling into DJ And just because it
Yeah.
like fits into this whole, like they didn't know what to do with Finn, and it
Yeah.
just feels like they sent him to Canto Bight because they needed him to be on screen more.
I would love to see what the original script was like, because
Sure.
and to wonder what was there originally something more for Finn in it, any of this stuff. Um, because I think you're right, and I think because where I keep kind of getting stuck is, should Finn have learned the lesson just from what happened with the Dreadnought? And I do think there's something important about the idea that if your heroes always learn the lesson from failure, I don't think that's accurate. I do think a lot of times people explain away, or they use excuses, or they try to, not acknowledge to themselves how much the failure was their fault and that they have to listen to that. The whole like you're not listening to the teacher idea. And so I feel like it is important that Poe doesn't just learn the lesson from what Leia tells him. He has to fail again. But I agree, I don't think it's well executed.
But like in the like Poe has a good arc
Yeah.
in this movie. I think we can agree on that. The problem I have is like Finn doesn't have a good arc or any
Yeah.
arc. I don't know. Like it's justice for Finn is what I
Yeah.
want.
Agreed. And we did an episode a long time ago about it. There's a animated special where it's an animated movie that's like, the Star Wars Summer Adventure or something like that. And it's mostly silly, but in it, Obi-Wan, like Force Ghost Obi-Wan specifically goes up to Finn and is like, "You're supposed to be a Jedi. Why aren't you a Jedi yet? I'm going to help teach
Oh,
you how to be a
what?
Jedi." Yeah, no, it's really, and I feel like it's like Star Wars first starting to acknowledge we screwed up. Finn should have been a Jedi. Um, and again, it was in this very like low stakes thing. We did an
Was
episode
it a
about it though.
Lego Star Wars?
Um, I think it is. It's either Lego or just plain animation. But I will find it and show the. I will share the link to both the movie itself and also our discussion of it. Um, but yeah, I think that's if there's a failure of Ryan Johnson and of Lucasfilm and of Disney, it's that they treated Finn badly and they didn't make him a Jedi. And I hope that the treatment of Hayden Christensen, and even more so the treatment of Ahmed Best, is that I think Disney understands that Lucasfilm and them themselves have not treated a lot of their characters, but especially their actors of color, very well. Because Rose Tran also gets completely shafted in that third movie. So we'll see.
Rostico?
Rose Tico, sorry. The actress is named
Kelly
Kelly
Marie
Marie
Tran.
Tran. Yeah, sorry, I got this mixed up. All right, well, Riki is
Yeah,
only.
and
Oh, go ahead.
well, I just want to comment on that. Like, I think like the Star Wars franchise, Disney, like whatever you want to call it, Lucasfilm, whatever this
Mm-hmm.
organization that creates Star Wars. I agree. There have been like these past failures of how they did not react properly to fandom, like and especially like racist hatred in
Mm-hmm.
fandom. And I thought how they reacted during the Obi-Wan Kenobi show to
Moses Ingram and all the attacks she got.
yes, yeah, to Moses Ingram, actress who plays Reva. That was them learning from the
Yep.
past and saying, we're just going to put our foot down now. And they made public statements. Ewan McGregor put out a lovely short video about it. And I don't know like if it was all done in the best way, but it was better than the past. And I think like
Yeah.
that's the point. Is like, okay, we acknowledge that in the past like there were these failures. And we're going to try a little something different, try to be better, and we're moving forward. And I think like that's the lesson, is like the overall lesson of this quote is don't get consumed by failure because it is a part of the process.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
can acknowledge it and then analyze it and try to learn from it.
I think you're that's really right. And just on what Disney has done, because in many ways, I think that the failure that happened with John Boyega and Finn, and Rose and Kelly Marie Tran is that they listen too much to the fans and their anger and, tone down Finn's story. And so to me, with Moses Ingram, not only did they defend her, but, they kind of have said, oh, you don't like that the second biggest star, maybe the third biggest star, was a person of color? Well, guess what? Here's The Acolyte, where the actual main character is played by a person of color. Which, funnily enough, it's the actress who played Rue in The Hunger Games, who also got a hell of a lot of shit because people were very upset that it was a black girl playing Rue, even though in the book they clearly state, that her skin is much darker than Katniss is, and her curly hair and other things like that. So yeah, the cycles go on and on. Anyway, we actually already talked about some other parts of Last Jedi. So for our bonus content, we're going to be talking about this idea and how we see it in kind of other media that we love or don't see it in other media we love. But for anyone who wants that, of course, you can become a member, only $5 a month, $55 a year. All that's in the show notes. All that is if you go to theethicalpanda.com. There also is all the ways to contact us. We love feedback. We want more feedback. Let us know what you think of this. Let us know what you think of the discussion. Let us know how you feel about all the different things we had to say. We actually got some feedback. I put up a feedback post on Facebook. I meant to discuss it here, but we'll discuss it in our next episode as part of that feedback. So please do that. Please become a member. Most importantly, though, remember, we have spoken.